Sarah Martinez walked through the crowded shopping mall with the quiet confidence of someone who had faced far worse than weekend crowds. Her short, practical haircut caught the fluorescent lights as she moved between stores, searching for a birthday gift for her niece. At 42, she carried herself with an unmistakable posture that spoke of years of discipline and training, though most people around her had no idea of her true identity. The day had started like any other weekend. Sarah had woken up in her modest apartment, the same apartment she had lived in for 3 years since retiring from active duty. The walls were sparse, decorated only with a few family photos and a single-framed certificate that visitors might mistake for a college diploma. She preferred it that way. Anonymity had become her shield in civilian life, protecting her from the questions and assumptions that came with her real profession. She had spent 24 years serving her country in ways most people could never imagine. The missions that took her to the darkest corners of the world, the split-second decisions that saved lives, the endless training that pushed her body and mind beyond normal human limits. But, looking at her now, in her simple jeans and plain sweater, no one would guess that she held one of the most respected positions in the United States Navy. The mall buzzed with typical weekend energy. Families pushed strollers past storefronts, teenagers gathered around the food court, and couples browsed hand in hand. Sarah appreciated these moments of normalcy. After decades of living in a world where every decision could mean life or death, there was something peaceful about watching people go about their ordinary lives, blissfully unaware of the dangers that existed beyond their comfortable bubble. She stopped at a toy store, scanning the shelves for something that would make her 8-year-old niece smile. Emma was the daughter of her brother Marcus, an accountant who lived 2 states away with his wife Jennifer. They were the only family Sarah had left after losing both parents in a car accident 5 years earlier. The loss had hit her hard, harder than she expected for someone who had dealt with death and loss throughout her career. But family was different. Family was the anchor that kept her grounded when everything else felt like shifting sand. As she picked up a colorful building set, Sarah noticed a commotion near the mall's central area. Raised voices carried over the general hum of conversation, and her trained instincts immediately kicked in. Years of experience had taught her to assess situations quickly, to identify potential threats before they escalated. What she saw made her jaw tighten with barely controlled anger. 3 young men, probably in their early 20s, had cornered a woman near the fountain. The woman appeared to be in her 30s, with shoulder-length brown hair and wearing a nurse's uniform, suggesting she had just finished a shift at the nearby hospital. She clutched a small purse against her chest and tried to step around the men, but they moved to block her path each time. "Come on, sweetheart," one of them said, his voice loud enough for Sarah to hear clearly. "Don't be like that. We just want to talk." "I need to get home," the woman replied, her voice steady but with an underlying tension that Sarah recognized immediately. It was the voice of someone trying to de-escalate a situation while fighting their own fear. "What's the rush?" another one laughed. "Your boyfriend won't mind if you're a little late." Sarah set down the toy and moved closer, keeping her steps casual, but positioning herself where she could intervene if necessary. She had seen this scenario play out too many times, both in civilian settings and in hostile territories abroad. Predators who mistook politeness for weakness, who thought intimidation was a game. The third man, who seemed to be the leader of the group, stepped even closer to the woman. "You know what? You're being really rude. We're just trying to be friendly here." "I appreciate that, but I really do need to go," the woman said, trying once more to move around them. "That's not very nice," the leader said, his tone shifting to something more menacing. "Maybe you need to learn some manners." That was enough for Sarah. She had heard that tone before, in interrogation rooms and during raids on terrorist compounds. It was the voice of someone who enjoyed having power over others, someone who got satisfaction from causing fear. In her world, those people were enemies. In the civilian world, they were bullies, but the principle remained the same. She approached the group with the same calm demeanor she had used to walk into hostile meetings with foreign officials. "Excuse me," she said, her voice carrying just enough authority to make all 4 people turn toward her. "Is there a problem here?" The leader looked her up and down dismissively. "This doesn't concern you, lady. Keep walking." Sarah smiled, but it was the kind of smile that had once made hardened enemy combatants reconsider their life choices. "I think it does concern me," she said evenly. "This young woman seems uncomfortable, and you gentlemen seem to be preventing her from leaving. That makes it my concern." "Oh yeah." The second man stepped forward, puffing out his chest in a display that might have been intimidating to someone who hadn't faced down armed militants in Afghan mountains. And what exactly are you going to do about it? Sarah took a single step forward, and something in her movement made the man instinctively step back. It wasn't anything dramatic or obvious, but 24 years of combat training had given her a presence that spoke directly to the primitive part of the human brain that recognized predators. "I'm going to ask you nicely to let this woman go about her business," she said, her voice remaining perfectly calm. "And then you're going to do exactly that." The leader laughed, but it sounded forced. "Listen, Grandma, why don't you mind your own business before you get hurt?" The woman they had been harassing looked between Sarah and the men, clearly confused by the sudden shift in dynamics. Sarah caught her eye and gave her a subtle nod toward the nearest exit. "Why don't you head home?" she said gently. "I think these gentlemen and I need to have a conversation." But the leader wasn't ready to give up his prey so easily. "She's not going anywhere until we say she can go," he said, grabbing the woman's arm. That was his first mistake. Sarah moved faster than anyone expected. Her hand shot out and grabbed the man's wrist, applying pressure to a specific point that she had learned during her first month of advanced combat training. The effect was immediate and dramatic. The man's grip on the woman's arm released instantly as pain shot up his arm, and he found himself unable to pull away from Sarah's seemingly gentle hold. "Let go of me," he gasped, trying to yank his arm free. "In a moment," Sarah said, her voice still perfectly calm. "First, I want you to apologize to this young woman for frightening her." The other two men started forward, but Sarah's free hand moved to her hip in a gesture that was both casual and unmistakably threatening. They stopped dead in their tracks, suddenly, realizing that this middle-aged woman in ordinary clothes was not what she appeared to be. "I'm not apologizing to anyone," the leader snarled, though his voice had lost some of its earlier confidence. Sarah increased the pressure slightly, and his knees nearly buckled. "I think you might want to reconsider that position," she said. "I have all day, and this pressure point can cause some very unpleasant long-term effects if maintained too long." The woman they had been harassing stared in amazement as this stranger effortlessly controlled a man twice her size. "Thank you," she whispered. "But you don't have to do this for me." "Yes, I do," Sarah replied without taking her eyes off the leader. Nobody should have to deal with this kind of behavior just for trying to go about their day. A small crowd had begun to gather, drawn by the unusual sight of an ordinary-looking woman holding three aggressive young men at bay with nothing more than a grip on one man's wrist. Mall security was nowhere to be seen, which didn't surprise Sarah. In her experience, authority figures rarely appeared when they were actually needed. Okay, the leader finally gasped. "I'm sorry, all right. I'm sorry. Say it to her, not to me," Sarah instructed. He turned his head toward the woman, his face red with pain and embarrassment. "I'm sorry for bothering you," he said through gritted teeth. "And you won't bother her or anyone else like this again," Sarah prompted. "No, we won't bother anyone again." Sarah released his wrist and stepped back, but she remained ready to move if any of them decided to try something stupid. The leader rubbed his wrist and glared at her with a mixture of pain and humiliation. "You think you're real tough, don't you?" he said, his voice shaking with anger. "I think I'm exactly as tough as I need to be," Sarah replied calmly. The second man, emboldened by his friend's defiance, sneered at Sarah. "You got lucky, but next time you might not be so fortunate." Sarah looked at him with the kind of steady gaze that had once made terrorist leaders confess to crimes they hadn't even been accused of. "There won't be a next time," she said simply, "because you're going to remember this moment every time you think about intimidating someone who can't fight back." The third man, who had been silent throughout the encounter, tugged at his friend's sleeves. "Come on, let's just go," he muttered. "This isn't worth it." But the leader wasn't ready to back down completely. "This isn't over," he said, pointing at Sarah. "We'll remember you." "Good," Sarah replied. "I hope you do." The three men walked away, their earlier bravado replaced by sullen anger and wounded pride. Sarah watched them until they disappeared into the crowd, her trained eyes tracking their movement and noting their direction in case they decided to double back. The woman they had been harassing approached Sarah with tears in her eyes. "I don't know how to thank you," she said. "They've been following me for blocks, ever since I left the hospital. I thought about calling the police, but they hadn't actually done anything illegal yet." "You don't need to thank me," Sarah said, her voice returning to its normal gentle tone. "I'm just glad you're safe." "How did you do that?" the woman asked, gesturing toward where the men had been standing. I've never seen anything like it. Sarah smiled, but it was a guarded expression. I took a few self-defense classes over the years, she said, which was technically true, though it barely scratched the surface of her actual training. The woman introduced herself as Rebecca Chun, a surgical nurse at Metropolitan General Hospital. She had indeed just finished a 12-hour shift and was exhausted when the three men started following her. I don't understand why some people think they can just intimidate others like that, she said, still shaking slightly from the encounter. Unfortunately, some people mistake kindness for weakness, Sarah replied. They think that just because someone doesn't immediately fight back, it means they won't or can't. Well, they certainly learned otherwise today, Rebecca said with a small smile. Can I buy you coffee or something? I feel like I owe you at least that much. Sarah was about to decline when something made her reconsider. Maybe it was the genuine gratitude in Rebecca's eyes, or maybe it was the reminder that normal human connections were something she had been neglecting in her post-military life. Actually, that sounds nice, she said. They found a quiet cafe in the mall's food court, away from the crowds and noise. Rebecca ordered a large coffee with extra caffeine, while Sarah settled for tea. As they sat across from each other, Sarah found herself studying the other woman with the same attention to detail that had served her well in intelligence briefings. Rebecca was probably 35, with intelligent eyes and steady hands that spoke of years of medical training. There was a kindness in her expression, but also a strength that suggested she was no stranger to difficult situations. Sarah respected that combination. Too often, she had encountered people who were one or the other, but rarely both. So what do you do? Rebecca asked, settling back in her chair with her coffee. I'm between jobs at the moment, Sarah replied, which was her standard answer when she wanted to avoid complicated explanations. Taking some time to figure out what comes next. That must be nice, Rebecca said. I sometimes think about taking a break from nursing, but there's always someone who needs help. Sarah nodded, understanding that sentiment more than Rebecca could possibly know. The desire to help others, to stand between danger and innocent people, had driven her entire adult life. It was both a blessing and a curse, that inability to simply walk away when someone needed protection. How long have you been a nurse? Sarah asked. 8 years, Rebecca replied. I started right out of college. My parents wanted me to become a doctor, but I liked the idea of actually spending time with patients instead of just diagnosing them and moving on. That takes a special kind of person, Sarah said, and she meant it. She had worked with military medics who displayed the same combination of technical skill and genuine compassion, and she had always held them in the highest regard. As they talked, Sarah found herself relaxing in a way she hadn't in months. There was something refreshing about a conversation that didn't involve strategy or tactics or life and death decisions. Rebecca talked about her patients, about the challenges of working in a busy hospital, about her small apartment, and her cat who had an attitude problem. It was ordinary and peaceful, and Sarah realized how much she had missed ordinary and peaceful. What about you? Rebecca asked. Any family. A brother and his family, Sarah replied. They live in Ohio. I don't see them as much as I should. It's hard to maintain relationships when work takes over your life, Rebecca said with understanding. I've lost touch with a lot of college friends because of my schedule. Sarah nodded, though her own isolation had more to do with the classified nature of her work than simple scheduling conflicts. There were very few people in her life who knew what she actually did for a living, and even fewer who understood what it really meant. Their conversation was interrupted by a commotion near the mall's main entrance. Sarah's head turned immediately, her senses automatically tuning in to potential threats. A security guard was talking animatedly to someone on his radio, his body language suggesting urgency. Probably just a shoplifter, Rebecca said, following Sarah's gaze. But Sarah's instincts told her it was something more. The guard was looking around the food court, his eyes scanning the crowd in a pattern that suggested he was looking for specific individuals rather than general troublemakers. When his gaze fell on their table, Sarah saw recognition flash in his eyes. The guard approached their table with purpose. Excuse me, ma'am, he said to Sarah. I need to ask you to come with me. Sarah raised an eyebrow. Is there a problem? There's been a complaint filed against you for assault, the guard said, his tone professional but firm. The police are on their way, and I need you to wait in the security office. Rebecca's mouth fell open. Assault? She helped me. Those men were harassing me. I'm just following procedure, ma'am, the guard said to Rebecca before turning back to Sarah. Will you come voluntarily, or do I need to call for backup? Sarah stood slowly, her mind already working through the implications. She wasn't surprised that the three men had filed a complaint. Bullies often tried to paint themselves as victims when their tactics backfired. What concerned her more was how this situation might escalate, and what it might reveal about her identity if she had to defend herself officially. "Of course," she said calmly. "I have nothing to hide." Rebecca stood as well. "I'm coming too. I was there. I saw everything. She was protecting me from those men." The security guard looked uncomfortable. "Ma'am, I appreciate your willingness to help, but right now I just need to secure the individual who was named in the complaint." As they walked toward the mall's security office, Sarah noticed several things that raised her concern. First, there were now 3 security guards instead of 1, which was excessive for a simple assault complaint. Second, 2 of them were positioned in ways that would cut off potential escape routes, which suggested they had been briefed to treat her as a serious threat. Third, and most troubling, one of the guards was speaking quietly into a radio, using terminology that sounded suspiciously like military or law enforcement codes. The security office was a small, windowless room with basic furniture and monitoring equipment. Sarah took a seat in the single chair while the guards positioned themselves strategically around the room. Rebecca was asked to wait outside, despite her protests. "The police should be here in about 10 minutes, the lead guard informed Sarah. "Until then, I need you to remain seated and keep your hands visible." Sarah complied, but her mind was racing. Something about this situation felt wrong. A simple assault complaint, even from 3 complainants, wouldn't typically warrant this level of security response. Either the 3 men had seriously exaggerated what happened, or there was something else going on. Her suspicions were confirmed when the door opened, and, instead of local police officers, 2 men in dark suits entered the room. They had the unmistakable bearing of federal agents, and Sarah's heart sank as she realized that her carefully maintained civilian anonymity was about to be shattered. "Ms. Martinez," the first agent said, closing the door behind him. "We need to talk." The 2 federal agents looked exactly like what Central Casting would order for a government thriller movie. Agent Morrison was tall and lean with graying hair and sharp eyes that seemed to catalog every detail in the room. Agent Peters was shorter and broader, with the kind of build that suggested he spent considerable time in the gym. Both wore identical dark suits and expressions of professional seriousness. "I think there's been some confusion," Sarah said, remaining seated but keeping her posture relaxed. "I was helping a woman who was being harassed. Whatever those men told you happened, I can assure you it was nothing more than a simple intervention." Agent Morrison pulled out a badge and held it up for her to see. "Agent Morrison, FBI. This is Agent Peters. And you're absolutely right that there's been some confusion, but not the kind you think." Sarah's mind immediately began working through possibilities. If federal agents were involved, it meant someone had run her name through databases that connected to her military service. The question was whether they knew her real rank and position, or if they had simply flagged her as former military. "The 3 individuals who filed the complaint," Agent Peters said, settling into a position near the door, described an encounter with a middle-aged woman who demonstrated what they called professional-level combat skills. "They were quite specific about the pressure point technique you used." "I told you, I took self-defense classes," Sarah replied, maintaining her cover story. Agent Morrison smiled, but it wasn't particularly friendly. "Ms. Martinez, we ran your name through our system after the complaint was filed. Imagine our surprise when most of your background information came back classified above our clearance level." Sarah felt her stomach tighten, but she kept her expression neutral. "I'm not sure what you mean." "What we mean," Agent Peters said, "is that according to our database, you don't exist. At least, not in any way we're authorized to know about. Your social security number is real, your driver's license is legitimate, but everything else about your background requires clearance levels that we don't have." "That's interesting," Sarah said carefully. "But I'm not sure what it has to do with a minor altercation at a shopping mall." Agent Morrison leaned forward. "It has to do with the fact that when we tried to dig deeper, we got a phone call from the Pentagon telling us to back off and release you immediately. That phone call came from an office that, according to our organizational charts, doesn't exist." Sarah closed her eyes briefly. This was exactly the kind of situation she had hoped to avoid by maintaining a low profile in civilian life. Someone, somewhere up the chain of command, had decided that her cover was more important than whatever local law enforcement issues might arise. The problem was that federal intervention would only raise more questions. "Look," she said, deciding to give them just enough truth to satisfy their curiosity without revealing anything critical. "I used to work for the government in a classified capacity. I'm retired now. Whatever you think you know about me, I can guarantee you don't have the full picture. What kind of classified capacity? Agent Peters asked. The kind that I can't discuss with people who don't have the appropriate clearance, Sarah replied. Agent Morrison stood up and began pacing the small room. This puts us in a difficult position. We have 3 citizens filing assault complaints against someone we've been ordered to release without charges. How exactly are we supposed to explain that? You could start by investigating the original harassment complaint, Sarah suggested. The woman they were bothering is named Rebecca Chun. She's a nurse at Metropolitan General Hospital, and she'll verify that those 3 men were intimidating her before I intervened. We'll definitely be speaking with Ms. Chun, Agent Peters assured her. But that doesn't resolve the larger issue here. Before Sarah could respond, Agent Morrison's phone buzzed. He answered it with a crisp, "Morrison," listened for a moment. Then, his expression changed dramatically. "Yes, sir. Understood. We'll handle it immediately." He hung up and looked at his partner with an expression that Sarah recognized. It was the look of someone who had just received orders that they didn't like, but couldn't question. "Change of plans," Agent Morrison said to Peters. "We're done here." "What do you mean, done?" Peters asked. "I mean, we released Ms. Martinez, we closed the file, and we forget this ever happened," Morrison said, his tone making it clear that this wasn't open for discussion. Peters looked confused. "What about the assault complaint?" "There was no assault," Morrison said firmly. Ms. Martinez was defending another citizen from harassment. Case closed. Sarah stood up slowly, understanding that whatever intervention had occurred on her behalf had come from very high up the chain of command. Someone with serious authority had decided that protecting her identity was worth making this entire incident disappear. "Am I free to go?" she asked. "You were always free to go," Agent Morrison said, though his tone suggested that this wasn't entirely true. "We appreciate your cooperation." As Sarah walked toward the door, Agent Peters spoke up again. "For what it's worth, those 3 guys were clearly trouble. You did the right thing helping that woman." "Thank you," Sarah said simply. She left the security office to find Rebecca pacing anxiously in the hallway. The moment she saw Sarah, relief flooded her face. "Are you okay?" Rebecca asked. "They wouldn't tell me what was happening. Something about federal agents and background checks." "It's complicated," Sarah said, which was perhaps the understatement of the century. "But everything's fine now. The charges were dropped." "Charges?" Rebecca's voice rose. "They were actually going to charge you for helping me?" "Some people have interesting ways of interpreting events," Sarah said diplomatically. They walked back through the mall together, past the curious stares of other shoppers who had witnessed the earlier drama. Sarah noticed that the 3 men who had started this whole situation were nowhere to be seen, which was probably for the best. "I still can't believe what just happened," Rebecca said as they reached the parking area. "Federal agents? For a mall incident?" Sarah realized she needed to give Rebecca some explanation that would satisfy her curiosity without revealing anything classified. Sometimes when you work for the government, even after you retire, there are complications. Paperwork that follows you around. "What kind of work did you do?" Rebecca asked. "Nothing very exciting," Sarah lied smoothly. "Just boring administrative stuff that happened to require security clearance." Rebecca clearly didn't believe her, but she was polite enough not to push further. "Well, whatever you used to do, I'm grateful you were there today. Those men were really starting to scare me." "Have you had problems with harassment before?" Sarah asked, her protective instincts still engaged. "Not like that," Rebecca admitted. "But working at the hospital, especially during night shifts, you encounter all kinds of people. Some of them don't handle stress or bad news very well." Sarah nodded, understanding the dangers that healthcare workers faced from unstable individuals. "Do you have any way to protect yourself? Self-defense training, pepper spray, anything like that?" "I've thought about taking a class," Rebecca said. "But between work and trying to have some kind of personal life, I never seem to find the time." "You should make the time," Sarah said seriously. "What happened today could happen again, and next time there might not be someone around to help." They reached Rebecca's car, a small sedan that had seen better days. "Would you?" Rebecca started, then stopped herself. "Never mind. That's probably a strange request." "What? Would you consider teaching me some basic self-defense? I mean, if you have time. I'd be happy to pay you for lessons." Sarah considered the offer carefully. On one hand, maintaining distance from civilians was probably the smart choice, especially after today's complications. On the other hand, Rebecca seemed like a genuinely good person who deserved to be able to protect herself. "I'm not really qualified to teach," Sarah said, which was another technical truth that completely misrepresented reality. "But I could recommend some good programs in the area." Oh, Rebecca said, clearly disappointed. Of course, I understand. Something in her tone made Sarah reconsider. Here was a woman who spent her days helping others, who had been targeted by predators simply for being kind and vulnerable seeming. Sarah had spent her entire career protecting people who couldn't protect themselves. How was this different? Actually, Sarah said, I suppose I could show you a few basic techniques. Nothing fancy, just simple ways to get away if someone grabs you. Rebecca's face lit up. Really? That would be amazing. But we'd need to keep it simple, Sarah warned. Basic escape moves, situational awareness, things like that. That's perfect, Rebecca said. When could we start? They agreed to meet at a local gym the following Saturday morning. As Rebecca drove away, Sarah stood in the parking lot and wondered if she was making a mistake. Getting involved in someone else's life, even in such a limited way, went against all the principles of maintaining a low profile. But, as she walked to her own car, she thought about the fear in Rebecca's eyes when those men had cornered her. She thought about all the other Rebeccas out there, good people trying to live their lives who became targets simply because predators saw them as easy prey. Her phone buzzed with a text message from an unknown number. Situation handled. Maintain current protocols. Command. Sarah deleted the message immediately and started her car. Someone in the Pentagon was clearly keeping tabs on her, which was both reassuring and concerning. It was nice to know that if things went seriously wrong, she had backup. But it also meant that her retirement wasn't as complete as she had hoped. The drive home took her through the quieter residential areas of the city, tree-lined streets with modest houses and small yards where children played and neighbors chatted over fences. This was the world she was trying to blend into, the peaceful civilian life she had earned after decades of service. But today had reminded her that peace was often fragile, and that evil didn't respect boundaries between military and civilian spaces. Those three men in the mall weren't foreign terrorists or enemy combatants, but they represented the same fundamental threat, people who used fear and intimidation to control others. Back in her apartment, Sarah made herself a simple dinner and tried to process the day's events. The intervention from federal agents troubled her more than she wanted to admit. It suggested that her cover wasn't as solid as she had believed, and that her past was closer to the surface than she preferred. She opened her laptop and composed a secure message to her former handler, using protocols that she had hoped never to need again. Today's incident may have compromised operational security. Request status update on cover identity. The response came back within an hour. Cover intact, but flagged in federal databases. Recommend continued low profile. Alternative protocols available if necessary. Sarah stared at the screen for a long moment before deleting both messages. Alternative protocols usually meant relocation, new identity, complete severance from any connections she had built in her current life. It was the nuclear option for maintaining security, but it came at the cost of everything she had tried to build in retirement. She thought about Rebecca, about the promise to teach her self-defense. She thought about her brother Marcus and his family, about the niece she still needed to buy a birthday present for. These were the connections that made civilian life meaningful, that gave her a reason to get up in the morning beyond duty and mission objectives. Her phone rang, interrupting her thoughts. The caller ID showed her brother's number. Hey, Marcus, she answered. Sarah, how are you doing? Jennifer was just saying we haven't heard from you in a couple of weeks. I'm fine, she said, settling back in her chair. Just the usual. How's Emma? Growing like a weed, Marcus laughed. She's been asking when Aunt Sarah is coming to visit again. Something about wanting to show you her gymnastics moves. Sarah smiled, the first genuine smile she'd had since the morning. Tell her I'm impressed that she's still practicing. I'll try to make it out there soon. Everything okay? You sound a little stressed. Marcus had always been good at reading her moods, even over the phone. It was one of the things she both loved and found challenging about having family. They knew her well enough to notice when something was wrong, but she couldn't share the details that would help them understand. Just a long day, she said. Nothing serious. They talked for another few minutes about family news, about Marcus's job at the accounting firm, about Jennifer's latest photography project. Normal, everyday conversations that reminded Sarah why she valued this civilian life enough to fight for it. After hanging up, she realized she had made her decision. She wouldn't request alternative protocols. She wouldn't run from the life she had built just because federal agents had become curious about her background. Instead, she would be more careful, more aware of how her actions might draw attention. And she would honor her promise to teach Rebecca some basic self-defense. Because protecting good people from those who would harm them wasn't just her job. It was who she was, regardless of what uniform she wore or didn't wear. The next morning brought another routine day, or what passed for routine in Sarah's carefully structured civilian life. She maintained physical fitness with a workout regimen that would have impressed professional athletes, though she was careful to exercise at home or in gyms where her capabilities wouldn't attract attention. She read voraciously, both fiction and nonfiction, catching up on all the books she'd never had time to read during active duty. But underlying the mundane activities was a new awareness that her anonymity wasn't as complete as she had believed. Someone in the federal law enforcement community had taken note of her, and that meant other people might start asking questions as well. She was preparing lunch when her doorbell rang. Through the peephole, she could see a woman in her 60s holding a casserole dish and smiling expectantly. Sarah recognized her as Mrs. Patterson, who lived in the apartment downstairs and had been trying to engage Sarah in neighborly conversation since she moved in. "Hello, dear," Mrs. Patterson said when Sarah opened the door. "I made too much tuna casserole again, and I thought you might enjoy some." "That's very kind of you," Sarah said, accepting the dish. "You really didn't need to do that." "Nonsense," Mrs. Patterson waved her hand dismissively. "I heard there was some excitement at the mall yesterday. Something about federal agents? I hope you weren't involved in anything dangerous." Sarah's blood ran cold. If Mrs. Patterson had already heard about federal agents, it meant the story was spreading through local gossip networks. Soon everyone in the neighborhood would be speculating about the quiet woman in apartment 3B who somehow attracted FBI attention. "I think there might be some exaggeration in whatever you heard," Sarah said carefully. "Just a minor misunderstanding that got blown out of proportion." "Well, you be careful, dear," Mrs. Patterson said, patting Sarah's arm. "This world is getting stranger every day. You never know who you can trust anymore." After Mrs. Patterson left, Sarah sat down with the casserole and considered her options. The story was already spreading, which meant more people would start paying attention to her. She needed to decide whether to accelerate her timeline for relocation or double down on her current identity. Her phone buzzed with a text from Rebecca. "Thanks again for yesterday. Looking forward to Saturday." Sarah stared at the message for a long moment. Rebecca represented everything good about civilian life: genuine human connection, the opportunity to help someone without it being part of a larger military mission, the simple pleasure of friendship. Running away now would mean abandoning not just Rebecca, but the entire life she had worked so hard to build. She typed back, "Me too. See you Saturday morning." It was a small decision, but it felt like drawing a line in the sand. She had spent decades serving her country in the shadows, sacrificing personal connections for the greater good. Now, in retirement, she had the right to choose her own battles. And if protecting her civilian life and the people in it required taking some risks, then so be it. But as she ate Mrs. Patterson's casserole, Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that yesterday's incident had set something in motion that she wouldn't be able to control. Federal attention, local gossip, and her own protective instincts were converging in ways that might force her hand sooner than she hoped. The afternoon brought another surprise in the form of a phone call from Agent Morrison. "Ms. Martinez? I hope I'm not disturbing you. What can I do for you, Agent Morrison?" Sarah asked, immediately on guard. "I wanted to follow up on yesterday's incident. We interviewed Ms. Chun, and her account completely supports your version of events. The 3 men who filed the complaint have withdrawn their statement." "Voluntarily?" Sarah asked. "Let's just say they decided it wasn't in their best interest to pursue the matter," Morrison replied. "But that's not why I'm calling." Sarah waited, knowing that federal agents rarely made social calls. "The thing is," Morrison continued, "what happened yesterday has raised some questions. Questions that my partner and I aren't cleared to ask, let alone get answers to. But it's made us both curious about just who you really are. I told you yesterday. You told us you used to work for the government in a classified capacity," Morrison interrupted. "But that covers a lot of ground. CIA analysts work in a classified capacity. So do NSA technicians and Pentagon janitors with security clearance." Sarah said nothing, letting him fill the silence. "But what you did yesterday," Morrison continued, "that wasn't the work of an analyst or a technician. That was someone with serious training in personal combat. Someone who could have seriously hurt those men if they had wanted to. Your point. My point is that somebody like you doesn't just retire and fade into suburbia without a very good reason. And usually, when people with your kind of background try to disappear, it's because they're either running from something or protecting something." Sarah felt her patience beginning to wear thin. "Agent Morrison, with all due respect, I've answered your questions cooperated with your investigation, and been cleared of any wrongdoing. What exactly do you want from me? I want to know if you're someone my community should be aware of, Morrison said bluntly. Because if you are who I think you might be, then having you in our jurisdiction without us knowing about it could be a problem. And who do you think I might be? Morrison was quiet for a moment. Special operations. The kind of special operations that doesn't officially exist and leaves no paper trail. The kind where everything is need to know and most people don't need to know. Sarah closed her eyes. Agent Morrison was more perceptive than she had given him credit for. I'm a retired government employee living quietly in civilian life, she said. That's all you need to know. Maybe, Morrison said. But if that changes, if your quiet civilian life becomes not so quiet, I hope you'll remember that local law enforcement can be an asset rather than an obstacle. The line went dead, leaving Sarah to contemplate yet another complication in her carefully ordered post-military existence. Agent Morrison had essentially offered an alliance, recognition that whatever she had done in service to her country earned her a certain level of professional courtesy from law enforcement. It was an offer she hoped she would never need to take him up on. Saturday morning arrived with the kind of crisp autumn air that made Sarah appreciate living in a climate with actual seasons. After years of deployments to deserts, jungles, and urban battlefields where the weather was either oppressively hot or dangerously cold, she had developed a deep appreciation for the moderate temperatures and changing leaves of suburban America. She arrived at the gym 15 minutes early, a habit ingrained by decades of military punctuality. The facility was a typical community fitness center, not the high-end establishments that catered to serious athletes, but clean and functional. Most importantly, it was relatively empty on Saturday mornings, which would give them privacy for their training session. Rebecca arrived exactly on time, carrying a small gym bag and wearing athletic clothes that suggested she took fitness seriously. I wasn't sure what to bring, she said, seeming slightly nervous. I've never done anything like this before. Just comfortable clothes and water, Sarah replied. We'll start with basic situational awareness and simple escape techniques. They found an empty corner of the gym away from the few other early morning exercisers. Sarah began with what she considered the foundation of all personal protection, awareness of surroundings and threat assessment. The most important thing to understand, Sarah said, is that the best self-defense is avoiding dangerous situations in the first place. What happened to you yesterday could have been prevented if you had noticed those men following you earlier. But how could I have known they were following me? Rebecca asked. I mean, people walk in the same direction all the time. Sarah smiled. This was exactly the kind of thinking that got good people into trouble. Let me ask you this. When you left the hospital, did you notice the same people behind you for more than 2 blocks? Rebecca thought about it. Actually, now that you mention it, I did notice them outside the hospital. And again when I stopped at the coffee shop. But I thought it was just coincidence. In personal security, we don't believe in coincidence, Sarah said. If you see the same person or group of people in multiple locations, especially if they seem to be adjusting their pace or direction to match yours, you should assume they're following you. She walked Rebecca through basic awareness techniques, using reflective surfaces to monitor what's behind you, varying your pace and direction to see if anyone matches your movements, identifying potential escape routes, and safe havens before you need them. This seems like a lot to think about just to walk down the street, Rebecca said after Sarah demonstrated how to use store windows as mirrors. It becomes second nature with practice, Sarah assured her. Just like how you probably check both ways before crossing a street without consciously thinking about it. They moved on to physical techniques, starting with the most basic principle of escape. Your goal is never to win a fight, Sarah explained. Your goal is to create enough distance and distraction to get away safely. Everything else is just ego, and ego can get you killed. She showed Rebecca how to break free from various types of grabs, wrist holds, arm grabs, bear hugs from behind. Each technique was simple and relied on leverage and anatomy rather than strength. The pressure point I used yesterday, Sarah said, demonstrating on Rebecca's wrist with gentle pressure, is effective because it attacks the nervous system directly. It doesn't matter how strong someone is if their nervous system tells their hand to let go. Rebecca was a quick learner, her medical background helping her understand the anatomical principles behind the techniques. This is like acupressure points, she said, practicing the wrist release. We use similar pressure points to help patients with pain management. Exactly, Sarah said, pleased that Rebecca was making the connections. The human body has numerous vulnerabilities that don't require strength to exploit, just knowledge and precision. As they practiced, Sarah found herself falling into the rhythm of instruction that she remembered from training junior operators. There was something satisfying about passing on knowledge that could save lives, even in this much smaller, personal context. "Can I ask you something?" Rebecca said during a water break. "Yesterday, when you stopped those men, you moved like you've done that before. I mean, really done it, not just learned it in a class." Sarah considered how to answer. "I've had some experience with difficult people," she said carefully. "Unfortunately, not everyone responds to polite conversation." "What kind of work did you do?" Rebecca pressed. "And don't tell me it was boring administrative stuff. I've seen administrative people, and they don't move like you do." Sarah was quiet for a moment, weighing how much truth she could safely share. "I was in the military," she said finally. "For a long time. I learned these things because I needed to know them." "What branch?" "Navy." Rebecca's eyes widened slightly. "Were you a SEAL?" Sarah's heart skipped a beat. Very few civilians knew enough about military structure to make that connection. "What makes you ask that?" "My brother was in the Marines," Rebecca explained. "He used to talk about the different special forces units. He said Navy SEALs were the ones who learned to fight like that, up close and personal." "There are a lot of different roles in the Navy," Sarah said, neither confirming nor denying. "Not everyone who learns combat skills is a SEAL." But Rebecca was clearly skeptical of that non-answer. "You were, weren't you? That's why the federal agents yesterday, and why you can do things that most people can't." Before Sarah could respond, they were interrupted by a disturbance near the gym's entrance. 3 men had walked in, and Sarah's blood ran cold as she recognized them from yesterday's mall encounter. They appeared to be scanning the gym, and when their eyes fell on Sarah and Rebecca, their expressions shifted to something predatory. "We need to leave," Sarah said quietly to Rebecca. "Now." "What? What?" Rebecca turned to see what Sarah was looking at, and her face went pale. "Oh my God, that's them. What are they doing here?" "They followed us," Sarah said, her mind immediately shifting into tactical mode. She assessed the gym's layout. One main entrance where the men were stationed, emergency exits that might or might not be unlocked, potential weapons, and barriers available if the situation escalated. The lead man, the one whose wrist Sarah had controlled yesterday, started walking toward them with his 2 companions flanking him. He was smiling, but it was the kind of smile that promised unpleasant things. Well, he called out as he approached. "Look what we have here." The tough lady and her friend, all alone in a nice, quiet gym. The few other people in the gym had stopped their workouts to watch what was clearly becoming a confrontation. Sarah noticed that none of them seemed inclined to intervene or call for help, which was typical civilian behavior when faced with obvious trouble. "I think you gentlemen need to leave," Sarah said, stepping slightly in front of Rebecca. "This is a private facility, and you're not welcome here." "Actually," the second man said, "we have memberships. We have every right to be here." Sarah realized that this wasn't a coincidence. They had planned this encounter, possibly even purchased gym memberships specifically to confront her and Rebecca in a location where they felt they had the advantage. "What do you want?" Rebecca asked, her voice shaky but defiant. "We want an apology," the leader said. "Your friend here humiliated us yesterday, and we think she needs to make it right." "She already got her apology yesterday," Rebecca said. "From you, remember?" "That was under duress," the third man spoke up. "Doesn't count when someone's twisting your arm." Sarah could see where this was heading. These men had spent the night nursing their wounded pride, and probably drinking, working themselves up to the point where confronting her seemed like a good idea. They wanted revenge, but they also wanted to do it in a way that wouldn't immediately bring law enforcement down on them. "Here's what's going to happen," Sarah said calmly. "You're going to turn around and walk out of here. You're going to cancel your memberships and never come back. And you're going to forget that Ms. Chun and I exist." The leader laughed. "Or what? You going to call your federal agent friends? Because we heard about that little intervention yesterday. Makes us wonder what kind of person has the FBI running interference for them." Sarah's estimation of these men went up slightly. They had done some research, which meant they weren't just random street thugs acting on impulse. That made them more dangerous, but also more predictable. "I don't need federal agents to handle 3 bullies," Sarah said. "But I'm hoping it won't come to that." "See, that's where you're wrong," the leader said, his voice dropping to something more menacing. "Because this time, we're ready for you." The second man reached into his gym bag and pulled out what looked like a telescoping baton, the kind that security guards sometimes carried. It wasn't illegal in most places, but it certainly escalated the threat level significantly. Sarah felt the familiar rush of adrenaline that came with imminent combat, but also a cold anger that these men would bring weapons into what should have been a safe space. More importantly, they were threatening Rebecca, who had done nothing except have the misfortune to be harassed yesterday. "Rebecca," Sarah said quietly, "I want you to walk toward the emergency exit behind us. Don't run, just walk normally." "I'm not leaving you alone with them," Rebecca said. "You're not helping by staying," Sarah replied firmly. "Go." The leader noticed Rebecca starting to move. "Nobody's going anywhere until we get our apology." "You already got your apology," Sarah said, positioning herself to block their approach to Rebecca. "What you really want is to feel like big men again after being embarrassed by a woman. But that's not going to happen." The man with the baton extended it with a sharp click that echoed through the gym. "Maybe we need to teach you some manners the hard way." That was enough talking. Sarah moved before he could fully raise the weapon, stepping inside his reach and driving her elbow into his solar plexus with precise force. He doubled over, gasping, and the baton clattered to the floor. The leader rushed her from the left, but Sarah had already shifted her weight and caught him with a palm strike to the nose that sent him staggering backward with blood streaming down his face. The third man hesitated, clearly not expecting his friends to go down so quickly. That hesitation was all the opening Sarah needed. She grabbed a 20-pound dumbbell from a nearby rack and hefted it meaningfully. "You have about 10 seconds to pick up your friends and leave," she said, her voice completely calm despite the fact that she had just disabled 2 attackers. "After that, this gets much worse for all of you." The third man looked at his companions, both of whom were clearly in no condition to continue fighting. Then, back at Sarah holding the dumbbell like it weighed nothing. "This isn't over," he said, but he was already moving to help his friends. "Yes, it is," Sarah replied. "Because if I see any of you again, anywhere, I'm going to call those federal agents you mentioned and explain how 3 men have been stalking and threatening a woman. I don't think they'll find that very amusing." As the 3 men limped out of the gym, the other patrons began to murmur among themselves. Sarah realized that once again, she had drawn exactly the kind of attention she had hoped to avoid in civilian life. "Are you okay?" Rebecca asked, returning to Sarah's side. "I'm fine," Sarah said, setting the dumbbell back on its rack. "But I think our training session is over for today." "That was incredible," Rebecca said, her eyes wide with admiration and something that might have been fear. "You took down 2 men in about 3 seconds." "Training," Sarah said simply, but she could see that Rebecca wasn't buying the modest explanation anymore. As they gathered their things, the gym manager approached them nervously. "Is everything all right here? Should I call the police?" "Everything's fine," Sarah assured him. "Just a misunderstanding that got resolved." "Those men said they were members here," the manager said. "They were lying," Sarah replied. "I'd recommend reviewing your security footage and making sure they don't try to come back." Outside the gym, Rebecca was quiet as they walked to their cars. Finally, she spoke. "You're not just former military, are you? You're something special. Something they don't talk about in normal conversation." Sarah stopped walking and turned to face her. "Rebecca, there are things about my background that I can't discuss. Not because I don't trust you, but because there are rules about what can and can't be shared. But you trust me enough to teach me self-defense, even after what happened yesterday with the federal agents." "That's different," Sarah said. "Teaching you to protect yourself doesn't compromise anything except your ability to be victimized." Rebecca nodded slowly. "Can I ask you one thing? And will you give me a straight answer?" "Depends on the question. Are you someone I should be worried about being around? I mean, are you in some kind of danger that could spill over onto me?" Sarah considered the question carefully. It was fair, and Rebecca deserved an honest answer. "I don't think so," she said. "I'm retired from whatever it was I used to do. But yesterday's incident with the federal agents, and today with these 3 idiots, suggests that staying completely anonymous might be harder than I hoped." "What does that mean for us?" "For these lessons. It means we need to be more careful about where and when we meet," Sarah said. "And it means you need to understand that learning from me might put you on the radar of people who ask uncomfortable questions." Rebecca was quiet for a moment, considering. Then, she smiled. "You know what? I spent 8 years in nursing school and working in hospitals, dealing with drug addicts, violent patients, and family members who blame medical staff for everything that goes wrong. I think I can handle some uncomfortable questions." "You might want to think about that," Sarah warned. "This isn't the same as dealing with difficult patients." "Maybe not," Rebecca said. "But yesterday, you put yourself at risk to help a stranger. Today, you did it again. Whatever secrets you're keeping, I don't think they make you a bad person." Sarah felt something she hadn't experienced in years. The warmth of being accepted by someone who understood, at least partially, who she really was. It was dangerous and foolish and completely against every principle of operational security she had ever learned. Same time next week? Rebecca asked. Sarah looked at this brave, stubborn woman who had somehow decided that learning self-defense from a mysterious former government operative was worth whatever risks it might entail. Same time next week, Sarah agreed, knowing that she was probably making a mistake, but unable to bring herself to care. As Rebecca drove away, Sarah sat in her car and contemplated the events of the past few days. The carefully constructed walls around her civilian life were starting to crumble, and she wasn't sure if she was willing or able to rebuild them. Her phone buzzed with another text from an unknown number. Incidents are being noted. Recommend increased discretion. Sarah deleted the message and started her car. Increased discretion was easier said than done when trouble seemed determined to find her. But one thing was becoming clear. She couldn't protect her cover identity by running away from every situation that threatened it. Sometimes, the best defense was standing your ground and controlling how much of yourself you revealed in the process. The question now was whether she could maintain that balance, or if the weight of her past would eventually crush the peaceful civilian life she had worked so hard to build. As she drove home through the quiet suburban streets, Sarah allowed herself to acknowledge something she had been avoiding. She had missed this. Not the violence or the danger, but the sense of purpose that came from protecting people who needed protection. Teaching Rebecca, standing up to bullies, using her skills for something beyond military objectives. It felt like a return to the ideals that had driven her to serve in the first place. The problem was that those same ideals might force her to make choices that would expose everything she had worked to keep hidden. That evening, Sarah received a phone call that changed everything. The number was blocked, but she recognized the voice immediately. Admiral Catherine Reynolds, her former commanding officer, and one of the few people who knew the full scope of Sarah's service record. Sarah, we need to talk. In person. Tonight. Admiral? What's wrong? Not over the phone. Meet me at the old location in 2 hours. The line went dead, leaving Sarah staring at her phone with a growing sense of dread. Admiral Reynolds wouldn't make contact unless something serious had happened, something that threatened not just Sarah's cover, but potentially national security. 2 hours later, Sarah sat in a 24-hour diner that she and the Admiral had used for debriefings during her transition to retirement. It was the kind of place where no one paid attention to quiet conversations between two women who looked like they could be discussing anything from family problems to book clubs. Admiral Reynolds arrived precisely on time, her silver hair and crisp civilian clothes doing nothing to diminish the aura of command authority that had made her one of the most respected officers in the Navy. She slid into the booth across from Sarah and ordered black coffee before getting straight to the point. Your mall incident has created some complications, she said without preamble. How so? The federal agents who intervened filed a report that flagged your identity in several databases. That report was noticed by people who shouldn't have access to information about you. Sarah felt her stomach tighten. What kind of people? The kind who hold grudges, Admiral Reynolds said grimly. You made enemies during your service, Sarah. Important enemies who thought they were safe from retaliation as long as you were deep undercover. Are you saying my cover is blown? I'm saying your cover is compromised enough that certain interested parties are starting to ask questions. Questions that could lead them to discover not just who you are, but where you are. Sarah closed her eyes, understanding the implications. During her years in special operations, she had been involved in missions that resulted in the capture or elimination of high-value targets. Some of those targets had powerful friends and family members who would be very interested in revenge if they could identify and locate her. What are my options? She asked. Relocation, new identity, complete severance from your current life. Sarah thought about Rebecca, about Mrs. Patterson and her casseroles, about the promise to visit her brother's family. And if I refuse? Admiral Reynolds leaned forward, her expression grave. Then, you need to understand that the peaceful retirement you've been enjoying is over. From now on, you'll be looking over your shoulder, wondering if every stranger is a potential threat. And anyone close to you becomes a potential target. The words hit Sarah like a physical blow. She had known this day might come, but she had hoped that her careful anonymity would protect both her and the people she cared about. How much time do I have to decide? Not much, Admiral Reynolds said. Our intelligence suggests that certain parties are already mobilizing assets to investigate the woman who attracted federal attention at a shopping mall in suburban America. Once they connect that woman to your service record, they'll come looking. As Admiral Reynolds left the diner, Sarah remained in her booth, staring at her untouched coffee and contemplating the ruins of her carefully constructed civilian life. Everything she had built, every connection she had made, was now a liability that could get innocent people killed. But, as she sat there, another thought began to form. For 3 years, she had been hiding from her past, pretending to be someone she wasn't. Maybe it was time to stop running and start using the skills that had made her one of the Navy's most effective special operations officers. If her enemies wanted to find her, perhaps it was time to let them come. The decision to stop running changed everything about how Sarah approached her daily life. Instead of avoiding attention, she began preparing for the confrontation that Admiral Reynolds had warned was inevitable. Her modest apartment was transformed into something resembling a forward operating base, with escape routes planned, communication protocols established, and defensive positions identified. But the most difficult part wasn't the tactical preparation. It was figuring out how to protect the innocent people who had become part of her civilian life without revealing the full extent of the danger they might face. Sarah's first priority was Rebecca. Their planned training session for the following Saturday needed to be much more than basic self-defense instruction. Rebecca needed to understand situational awareness, threat assessment, and emergency procedures without understanding why these skills might become critically important very soon. She spent Tuesday evening researching Rebecca's background more thoroughly than she had ever done before. It wasn't surveillance in the traditional sense, but rather the kind of protective intelligence gathering she had once done for high-value assets who were operating in hostile territory. She needed to know Rebecca's routines, her vulnerabilities, and, most importantly, the people in her life who might also become targets. What she discovered was both reassuring and troubling. Rebecca lived alone in a secure apartment building, worked regular shifts at a hospital with good security, and maintained a small circle of close friends who were all healthcare professionals. The reassuring part was that her lifestyle was relatively predictable and defensible. The troubling part was that she had no experience with the kind of threats that might soon materialize. Wednesday brought an unexpected visitor. Sarah answered her door to find Agent Morrison standing in the hallway, looking distinctly uncomfortable. "Agent Morrison," Sarah said, keeping her expression neutral. "This is unexpected. Can we talk?" he asked. "Preferably inside." Sarah hesitated, then stepped back to let him enter. Her apartment was neat and sparse, but she realized that to a trained investigator, it would reveal more than she intended. The lack of personal items, the positioning of furniture to provide clear sight lines to all entrances, the subtle modifications she had made to improve security, all of it painted a picture of someone living in a state of perpetual readiness. "Interesting place," Morrison said, taking in the details. "Very organized." "I like things neat," Sarah replied. "What can I do for you?" Morrison sat down carefully on the edge of her couch, still studying the room. "I had an interesting conversation yesterday with someone from the Pentagon. Actually, several someones. They were very polite, very professional, and very clear about the fact that I should forget you exist." Sarah said nothing, waiting for him to continue. "The thing is," Morrison went on, "when federal agents start getting phone calls from people who outrank everyone they've ever met, telling them to back off a civilian investigation, it tends to make us more curious, not less." "I'm not sure what you want me to say to that." "I want you to tell me if you're in danger," Morrison said bluntly. "Because if you are, and if that danger might spill over into my jurisdiction, I need to know about it." Sarah considered her options. Agent Morrison had been respectful and professional in their interactions, and his offer of cooperation might prove valuable if things went badly. More importantly, local law enforcement could provide an early warning system if hostile operatives began operating in the area. "Hypothetically," Sarah said, "if someone with my background had made certain enemies during their service, and if those enemies had recently become aware of that person's civilian identity and location, what would your advice be?" Morrison's expression became very serious. "Hypothetically, I would advise that person to contact federal authorities immediately and request protective custody or relocation assistance. And if that person had reasons to believe that official protection might not be sufficient, then I would say that person was in very serious trouble," Morrison replied. "And I would hope they had enough sense to accept help when it was offered." Sarah met his gaze steadily. "Help from whom?" "From someone who knows the local area, has access to resources and intelligence networks, and has a vested interest in preventing violent crimes in his jurisdiction." It was a carefully worded offer of alliance, and Sarah recognized it for what it was. Morrison was essentially volunteering to serve as an unofficial liaison between her situation and local law enforcement, operating outside normal channels to avoid the bureaucratic complications that might arise from her classified background. I appreciate the offer, Sarah said. If the hypothetical situation becomes less hypothetical, I'll consider reaching out. Don't wait too long, Morrison warned as he stood to leave. In my experience, these situations tend to escalate faster than people expect. After he left, Sarah called Rebecca to move up their training schedule. Something's come up, she said when Rebecca answered. Can you meet tonight instead of Saturday? Is everything okay? Rebecca asked, picking up on the tension in Sarah's voice. I'll explain when I see you. Same gym, 8 o'clock. The gym was nearly empty when they met that evening. Sarah had deliberately chosen a time when they would have maximum privacy and minimum witnesses for what might be their most important training session. I need to teach you some things that go beyond basic self-defense, Sarah said without preamble. And I need you to trust me enough to learn them without asking too many questions. Rebecca studied Sarah's face carefully. This is about your past catching up with you, isn't it? What makes you say that? Because you look like you're preparing for war, Rebecca said simply. And people don't prepare for war unless they expect to fight one. Sarah realized that Rebecca was more perceptive than she had given her credit for. There might be some complications in my life over the next few weeks, she said carefully. I want to make sure you can protect yourself if those complications affect you. What kind of complications? The kind where people might try to use you to get to me, Sarah admitted. The kind where knowing me might put you in danger. Rebecca was quiet for a moment, processing this information. Are you giving me a chance to walk away? I'm giving you all the information I can so you can make an informed decision, Sarah said. If you want to end our friendship now, I'll understand. It might even be the smart choice. And if I don't want to end our friendship, then you need to learn how to disappear, how to recognize surveillance, and how to contact people who can help you if something goes wrong. Rebecca squared her shoulders in a gesture that reminded Sarah of young soldiers accepting their first dangerous assignment. Teach me. They spent the next 2 hours covering advanced situational awareness, counter-surveillance techniques, and emergency protocols. Sarah taught Rebecca how to use public transportation to lose potential followers, how to identify and approach safe locations, and how to communicate distress without alerting potential threats. This is like something out of a spy movie, Rebecca said as they practiced dead drops and coded messages. The techniques are the same, Sarah confirmed. The stakes are just more personal. As they prepared to leave, Rebecca asked the question Sarah had been dreading. Who are you really? I mean, what did you do that would make people want to hunt you down now? Sarah looked at this brave woman who had somehow become one of the most important people in her new life, and made a decision that went against every principle of operational security she had ever learned. I was a Navy SEAL, she said, for 24 years. I commanded special operations teams that conducted missions in places that don't officially exist. Some of the people we captured or eliminated had friends and family members who hold grudges. Rebecca's eyes widened. A SEAL? Like an actual Navy SEAL? Like an actual Navy SEAL. Actually, more than that. I was a general. I commanded other SEALs. I've never heard of female SEAL generals, Rebecca said. Most people haven't, Sarah replied. We're not exactly common, and the ones who exist don't usually advertise it. Rebecca sat down heavily on a nearby bench. So when those men attacked you yesterday, and when you stopped that harassment at the mall, I was operating on instincts and training that I've been developing for over 2 decades, Sarah finished. It's not something I can turn off, and it's not something I can hide indefinitely. And now your enemies know where you are. They're starting to figure it out, Sarah said, which means anyone associated with me becomes a potential target for leverage. Rebecca was quiet for several minutes, staring at the floor as she processed this information. When she finally looked up, her expression was determined rather than fearful. What do you need me to do? Sarah felt a mixture of admiration and concern. I need you to be very careful for the next few weeks. Follow the protocols we just practiced, vary your routines, and trust your instincts if something feels wrong. What about you? What are you going to do? I'm going to stop hiding and start being proactive about the threat, Sarah said. Running away and changing identities doesn't solve the problem. It just delays it. That sounds dangerous. Less dangerous than waiting for them to find me when and where they choose, Sarah replied. At least this way, I have some control over the timing and circumstances. As they walked to their cars, Rebecca asked one more question. If something happens to you, how will I know? Sarah pulled out a business card and wrote a number on the back. If I miss 2 scheduled contacts in a row, call this number and tell them Phoenix is down. They'll know what that means. Phoenix, my operational call sign, Sarah said. Some habits die hard. Thursday and Friday passed in a blur of preparation and intelligence gathering. Sarah used contacts she hadn't spoken to in years to gather information about potential threats. What she learned was disturbing but not unexpected. A consortium of foreign operatives and criminal organizations had indeed begun investigating the identity of the woman who had attracted FBI attention in suburban America. More concerning was the indication that they were close to making a positive identification. Sarah's careful anonymity was crumbling faster than she had hoped, which meant she needed to accelerate her own timeline. Saturday morning brought the confrontation she had been expecting, but not in the way she had planned for it. Sarah was returning from an early morning run when she noticed the surveillance. 2 men in a sedan parked across from her apartment building, positioned to watch both the main entrance and the parking garage. They were professionals, but they weren't quite good enough to remain invisible to someone with her level of training. Instead of approaching her building directly, Sarah continued her run to a predetermined observation point where she could study the situation more carefully. Using pocket binoculars, she counted at least 4 operatives maintaining surveillance on her building, with at least 2 more positioned to watch the surrounding streets. They had found her, but they hadn't moved in yet. That suggested they were conducting reconnaissance before launching whatever operation they had planned. It also gave Sarah a window of opportunity to take the initiative. Her phone buzzed with a text message from an unknown number. "We have your friend. Come alone to Warehouse District. Building 47. 1 hour." Sarah's blood ran cold. Rebecca wasn't scheduled to work today, which meant she should have been safe in her apartment. The fact that they had taken her meant either Sarah's enemies were more sophisticated than she had expected, or they had inside information about her personal connections. She immediately tried calling Rebecca's number, but it went straight to voicemail. A second text arrived. "No police. No backup. Just you, or she dies." Sarah realized she was facing the exact scenario she had hoped to avoid. Innocent people being used as leverage against her. Every instinct told her that walking into an obvious trap was suicide, but leaving Rebecca in enemy hands was equally unthinkable. She made her decision in the same way she had made hundreds of life and death decisions during her military career, by accepting the risks and focusing on the mission objective. The mission was to save Rebecca. Everything else was secondary. But that didn't mean she had to be stupid about it. Sarah spent 30 minutes conducting counter-surveillance to ensure she wasn't being followed, then drove to a storage facility she had rented under a false identity. Inside the storage unit was a collection of equipment she had hoped never to need again: tactical gear, weapons, surveillance equipment, and communications devices. She armed herself with a pistol, backup magazines, a tactical knife, and a small explosive device that could serve as either a breaching charge or a last resort weapon. She also activated an emergency beacon that would alert Admiral Reynolds to her situation if she failed to deactivate it within 4 hours. The Warehouse District was exactly the kind of location she would have chosen for a hostile operation, isolated, with multiple entry and exit routes, and numerous positions for concealed overwatch. Building 47 was a 3-story structure that appeared to be abandoned, with broken windows and graffiti-covered walls.